March 9th to 10th, 1945. Tokyo. Radar operators at Japanese Air Defense Headquarters watch hundreds of blips appear on their scopes approaching from the south. B-29 Superfortresses. Again, the 279th raid on the Japanese home islands in 9 months. They scramble every available interceptor, Zeros, Ki-84s, Ki-61s, even experimental jets barely functional. Pilots climb desperately toward the bomber stream, knowing what's coming. At 25,000 feet. Zero pilot Lieutenant Saburo Sakai feels his engine overheating. His controls are sluggish in the thin air. He's gasping for oxygen through a mask that barely works. Above him, 8,000 feet higher, he sees them, silver bombers in perfect formation, untouchable. Their contrails mock his efforts. He knows other pilots are dying trying to reach that altitude. Engines seizing. Pilots blacking out from hypoxia. Aircraft stalling and spiraling into death dives. Then the bombs fall. Not on military targets this time, on civilians. Incendiary clusters that create a firestorm visible from 150 miles away. By dawn, 100,000 people are dead. 16 square miles of Tokyo reduced to ash. More casualties than Hiroshima. All delivered by bombers flying so high that Japanese fighters literally couldn't reach them. The psychological impact was total. You can't defend against what you can't reach. You can't shoot down what you can't catch. The B-29 didn't just bomb Japan into submission, it demonstrated technological superiority so absolute that continued resistance became irrational. Before we reveal how America built a bomber Japan couldn't stop, obliterate that subscribe button. Like and comment which WWII aircraft you think was most advanced. This channel exposes the technology that actually won wars. Now let me show you why Japanese pilots called it the unkillable dragon. The B-29 Superfortress shouldn't have existed. Not in 1944. Anyway, when Boeing began design work in 1938, the specifications read like science fiction. The Army Air Corps wanted a bomber that could fly 400 miles per hour, operate at 35,000 feet, carry 20,000 pounds of bombs, and defend itself with remote-controlled gun turrets. Every requirement violated what aircraft engineering considered possible with 1930s technology. Boeing's engineers stared at these specs and realized they weren't being asked to improve existing designs. They were being told to invent an entirely new category of aircraft. The developmental cost reflected this ambition. By the time the first B-29 entered combat in June 1944, the program had consumed $3 billion, more expensive than the Manhattan Project that would produce atomic bombs. For comparison, B-17 Flying Fortress development cost roughly $200 million. The B-29 required 15 times more investment because it pioneered technologies that didn't exist when the project started. Pressurized cabins at bomber scale, computer-controlled defensive systems, engines producing 2,200 horsepower each when most aircraft engines peaked at 1,000. At the heart of the B-29's capability was the Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine. 4 of these 18-cylinder radial monsters gave the B-29 a combined 8,800 horsepower, roughly double what a B-17 could generate. But that power came with terrifying reliability problems early in development. The R-3350 ran so hot that cylinder heads would crack during extended operations. Cooling baffles would melt. In extreme cases, engines would literally catch fire in flight. Test pilots called them widowmakers and refused to fly B-29s with more than 2 engines during early trials. Boeing engineers worked frantically through 1942 and 1943 redesigning cooling systems, improving fuel injection, and strengthening components that kept failing catastrophically. By early 1944, the R-3350 had become marginally reliable. Still prone to overheating, still requiring constant maintenance, but functional enough for combat operations. Crews never fully trusted them. Every B-29 mission involved engines that might quit without warning, potentially over Japanese-controlled territory thousands of miles from friendly bases. Yet those temperamental engines delivered performance that made every risk worthwhile. The B-29 could cruise at 220 miles per hour at 25,000 feet while carrying a full bomb load. Maximum speed approached 360 miles per hour at optimal altitude, faster than many Japanese fighters. More critically, the service ceiling reached 31,850 feet, and the aircraft could maintain that altitude with comfortable margins. A fully loaded B-29 could fly higher than most interceptors could climb, creating an engagement envelope that favored the bomber in ways no previous aircraft had achieved. The pressurization system represented another revolutionary leap. Previous bombers operated unpressurized, meaning crews above 10,000 feet needed oxygen masks and endured brutal cold. At 30,000 feet, temperatures dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Crew members suffered frostbite, hypoxia, and exhaustion from merely existing in that hostile environment for hours. The B-29 changed everything. Its cabin maintained pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet even when flying at 32,000. Crews could work in shirt sleeves, breathing normally, with heating systems keeping temperatures comfortable. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about combat effectiveness. A B-29 crew arrived over target alert, warm, and fully oxygenated. Japanese interceptor pilots climbing to engagement altitude arrived hypoxic, freezing, and exhausted from the climb itself. Their aircraft weren't pressurized. Their oxygen systems were primitive. By the time a Japanese fighter reached 30,000 feet, the pilot might be borderline unconscious while the B-29 crew above operated at peak efficiency. The central fire control system separated the B-29 from every bomber that came before it. Traditional bomber defense involved gunners manually operating machine guns from exposed positions, freezing at altitude, fighting hypoxia while trying to track fast-moving fighters. The B-29 eliminated human error through automation. 5 gunners operated 12.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon remotely, using periscopic sights connected to an analog computer that calculated lead angles, deflection, and range automatically. The system worked through electrical servos. A gunner in the pressurized cabin would track a target through his sight. The computer analyzed the target speed and trajectory, calculated the required gun position, and transmitted commands to remote turrets. The guns would swing into position and fire, all without the gunner touching the weapons themselves. For turrets, upper forward, upper aft, lower aft, plus a tail position provided overlapping fields of fire covering every approach angle. Any attacker entering range of one turret automatically became visible to adjacent turrets, allowing coordinated defensive fire. Japanese pilots encountering this system for the first time reported confusion and terror. They'd approach from angles that should have been blind spots, only to receive accurate fire from turrets they couldn't even see rotating to engage them. The computerized system reacted faster than human reflexes, tracked more precisely than human vision, and coordinated multiple turrets in ways manual gunnery never could. Captain Yasuhiko Kuro, flying a Ki-84 interceptor, described an attempted attack in November 1944. I approached from below and behind, the classic kill position. Before I could fire, tracers converged on my aircraft from 3 separate turrets. How did they see me? How did they react so quickly? It was like fighting a thinking machine. The ammunition capacity backed up the sophisticated fire control. Each gun had between 500 and 1,000 rounds, enough for sustained engagements against multiple attackers. Previous bombers often ran out of ammunition during extended fights. B-29s could defend themselves throughout the entire mission profile. More critically, the .50 caliber rounds could damage or destroy Japanese fighters at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Japanese pilots learned that closing to effective cannon range meant crossing a killing zone where the B-29's computer-aimed weapons had every advantage. But the psychological impact exceeded the physical damage inflicted. Japanese fighter pilots had trained for years mastering deflection shooting, the art of leading a moving target to account for bullet travel time and target velocity. This required split-second mental calculations that only the best pilots could consistently execute. The B-29's computer performed those calculations automatically and perfectly every time. A mediocre B-29 gunner with the computerized system could achieve accuracy that matched or exceeded ace fighter pilots. This invalidated years of Japanese training and experience. The defensive firepower created a dilemma that Japanese air commanders never solved. Single fighters attacking isolated B-29s rarely survived long enough to inflict critical damage. The solution? Massed attacks by 10 to 15 fighters overwhelming one bomber's defenses, worked theoretically but required coordination, timing, and numbers that Japanese forces couldn't consistently achieve by late 1944. Their pilot losses had been catastrophic throughout 1943 to 1944. Experienced aces who might coordinate complex attacks had mostly died at Midway, Guadalcanal, or New Guinea. The replacement pilots facing B-29s in 1945 were teenagers with minimal training, terrified of the silver machines their instructors said couldn't be stopped. The defensive systems created another unexpected advantage. They freed the formation to operate differently than other bomber types. B-17s and B-24s flew in tight defensive boxes where mutual supporting fire protected the formation. These boxes made excellent targets for flak because aircraft couldn't maneuver independently without braking protection. B-29 formations could spread out, giving each aircraft room to maneuver while still maintaining defensive coverage. When flak opened up, B-29s could make gentle evasive turns that disrupted firing solutions without leaving anyone exposed. The computer-controlled turrets maintained coverage during these maneuvers, something manual gunners in other bombers struggled to achieve. June 15, 1944, Yoita, Japan. The first B-29 raid on the Japanese home islands. 68 superfortresses lifted off from bases in China, part of Operation Matterhorn. The preliminary campaign before the Marianas bases became operational. Japanese radar detected them hours before arrival, tracking the formations as they approached across the East China Sea. Air Defense Headquarters scrambled every available fighter. Over 100 interceptors climbed desperately to meet the threat, pilots expecting encounters similar to fighting B-17s over the Pacific Islands. The Japanese pilots encountered something they couldn't process. The B-29s were flying at 28,000 to 30,000 feet, altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to maintain controlled flight. Zeros could theoretically reach 33,000 feet under ideal conditions, but combat maneuvering at that altitude was nearly impossible. Engines overheated from prolonged full-throttle climbs. Controls became sluggish in thin air. Pilots gasped for oxygen through masks that barely supplied sufficient flow. By the time Japanese fighters reached interception altitude, they arrived with minutes of fuel remaining, barely able to maintain formation, let alone conduct aggressive attacks. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi, flying a Ki-61 Tony, described the frustration in his combat diary. "We climbed for 20 minutes to reach them. My engine was overheating, temperature gauge deep in the red. When I finally reached their altitude, I had maybe 5 minutes before fuel forced me to descend. I tried approaching from ahead, but my aircraft mushed, controls barely responding. I fired from 800 meters but couldn't maintain the attack angle. They didn't even maneuver. They just kept flying in formation as though we weren't there. The altitude advantage alone would have been devastating, but combined with speed differentials, it became insurmountable. A zero at 28,000 feet could manage perhaps 190 miles per hour before controls became dangerously ineffective. The B-29s cruised at 220 miles per hour at that altitude and could surge to 240 if pressed. Japanese fighters couldn't catch bombers that were simply flying their normal cruise speed. The only viable attack geometry was head-on, giving Japanese pilots perhaps 3 to 4 seconds of firing opportunity before having to dive away to avoid collision. Head-on attacks required extraordinary courage and precision. Closing speed exceeded 400 miles per hour. Distance collapsed so rapidly that firing solutions lasted eye blinks. Japanese pilots who'd trained against slower bombers found their deflection calculations useless. By the time they processed target position and initiated firing, the B-29 had already passed. Worse still, the computerized defensive system tracked incoming fighters with inhuman precision. Japanese pilots approaching head-on faced converging fire from forward turrets controlled by gunners who'd already computed the correct lead angles. The Yoita raid demonstrated every advantage the B-29 possessed. Of 68 bombers participating, only one was shot down by fighters and 6 more sustained damage, requiring emergency landings at forward bases. Japanese defenders flew over 300 sorties and achieved minimal results despite outnumbering the attackers significantly. Post-battle analysis by Japanese Air Defense Headquarters revealed a terrifying conclusion. Standard interception tactics were ineffective. The B-29s operated in an engagement envelope where Japanese aircraft performance degraded catastrophically while American performance remained optimal. Japanese engineers immediately began developing solutions. They stripped weapons and armor from existing fighters, creating lightweight interceptor variants that could reach higher altitudes. They worked on pressure suits and improved oxygen systems for pilots. They experimented with upward-firing cannons that would allow attacks from below without exposing fighters to defensive fire. But these solutions required months or years to implement, and B-29 raids wouldn't wait. The psychological impact on Japanese fighter pilots was immediate and corrosive. They trained to be samurai of the air, warrior elites defending the homeland through skill and courage. Now they faced machines they couldn't reach, couldn't catch, and couldn't effectively attack even when they succeeded in positioning for shots. Every sortie became an exercise in futility, burning precious fuel, risking mechanical failures from pushing engines beyond limits, watching helplessly as silver bombers destroyed targets with impunity. November 1944, the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam became operational as B-29 bases. This changed everything about the strategic bombing campaign. The China bases required dangerous flights over the Himalayas just to deliver fuel and bombs to the staging areas. The Marianas sat 1,500 miles from Tokyo, within comfortable B-29 range, and could be supplied by sea. Within weeks, hundreds of superfortresses concentrated on Pacific islands that had been worthless jungles 6 months earlier. General Curtis LeMay assumed command of XXI Bomber Command in January 1945 and immediately recognized that high-altitude precision bombing wasn't working. Weather over Japan was consistently terrible, cloud cover, jet stream winds, and visibility issues made accurate bombing from 30,000 feet nearly impossible. The B-29s were reaching targets, but bombs scattered across wide areas with minimal damage to intended objectives. LeMay reviewed the data and made a decision that horrified his staff. Abandon altitude advantage and attack at night from 5,000 to 7,000 feet with incendiary bombs. The logic was brutal. Japanese cities were built primarily from wood and paper. Precision wasn't necessary. Area saturation would achieve better results than precision strikes on specific factories. Flying low eliminated navigational errors from high winds and improved bombing accuracy. Night operations reduced fighter interception risk. And most controversially, LeMay ordered removal of defensive guns except tail turrets to maximize bomb capacity. The B-29s would rely on darkness and speed rather than altitude and firepower. The crews believed LeMay was sending them to their deaths. Flying at 7,000 feet put them well within range of every flak gun Japan possessed. Removing defensive weapons meant any interceptor that found them could attack freely. But LeMay had calculated that Japanese night fighting capability was minimal, their radar coverage inadequate, and their fighter forces too depleted to mount effective opposition. He was betting hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives on intelligence assessments and mathematical projections. March 9 to 10, 1945. Operation Meeting House, the Tokyo firebombing. 334 B-29s loaded with M69 incendiary clusters lifted off from the Marianas. Each aircraft carried roughly 7 tons of incendiaries, over 2,000 tons total for the raid. They arrived over Tokyo after midnight, Pathfinder aircraft dropping initial bombs to mark target zones. The main force followed, releasing incendiary clusters that broke apart at 2,000 feet, scattering individual bomblets across massive areas. The results exceeded even LeMay's projections. The incendiaries ignited thousands of fires simultaneously across 16 square miles of Tokyo's most densely populated districts. Individual fires merged into a conflagration that created its own weather system. Superheated air rising so rapidly that hurricane-force winds rushed in to replace it. The firestorm reached temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Canals boiled, metal melted. People caught in the open burst into flames from radiant heat without direct fire contact. B-29 crews 5,000 feet above could smell burning flesh. Turbulence from the firestorm tossed aircraft violently despite being thousands of feet above the flames. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant Richard Marshall later described looking down and seeing hell, just hell. The entire city glowing red-orange like a photograph of the sun's surface. I could see people running, but there was nowhere to run to. Everything was burning. By dawn, over 100,000 people were dead. More casualties than Hiroshima or Nagasaki would suffer from atomic bombs. Another 1 million were homeless. 16 square miles of urban Tokyo had ceased to exist. The Japanese firefighting infrastructure, already inadequate, had been completely overwhelmed. And critically, Japanese air defenses had proven exactly as ineffective as LeMay predicted. Only 14 B-29s were lost, a 4.2% loss rate that was sustainable even if repeated nightly. The Tokyo firebombing proved that LeMay's low-altitude tactics worked, but it also revealed the strategic calculation behind the entire B-29 campaign. This wasn't precision warfare targeting military infrastructure. This was systematic destruction of Japan's ability and will to continue fighting. Over the following months, B-29s methodically burned Japan's major cities. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, each received the same treatment. Multiple raids, thousands of tons of incendiaries, entire urban districts reduced to ash. Japanese air defenses proved incapable of stopping or even significantly hindering these raids. By spring 1945, Japan's fighter pilot corps had been reduced to teenagers with minimal training flying against crews that had months of combat experience. The technological gap, already insurmountable in mid-1944, had widened further. B-29s equipped with radar bombing systems could attack through clouds that made visual interception impossible. Their electronic countermeasures jammed Japanese radar, making ground-controlled intercept nearly useless. But the most devastating aspect wasn't the physical destruction. It was the psychological impact on both Japanese civilians and military leadership. Every night, air raid sirens would wail. Every night, people would evacuate to shelters. And most nights, the bombers wouldn't come. B-29s would be hitting some other city, or weather would scrub the mission, or targets would shift based on intelligence. The uncertainty was torture. You couldn't predict when your city would burn. You just knew it would eventually, and nothing could prevent it. Japanese fighter pilots described a specific kind of despair during this period. They'd scramble to intercept formations, climb to altitude burning precious fuel, and watch the B-29s continue serenely toward their targets. Occasionally, they'd achieve firing positions and score hits. Rarely, they'd see a B-29 falter and fall. But the formations never broke, never turned back. The bombers kept coming in perfect geometric precision, absorbing losses that would have shattered Japanese formations, delivering their loads and returning to base. The nickname Silver Dragons emerged from this period, Japanese for Jinryu. It wasn't affectionate. Dragons in Japanese mythology were forces of nature, unstoppable and indifferent to human resistance. The B-29s embodied that quality. They appeared in skies, unleashed destruction, and departed. No amount of courage or sacrifice from interceptor pilots made meaningful difference. The dragons came, burned cities, and left, then returned days later to burn more. WWII June 1945. Japan's major cities had been systematically destroyed. Industrial production had collapsed, not from precision strikes on factories, but from eliminating the workers, housing, and infrastructure that allowed industrial activity. Transportation networks were shattered. Civilian morale had disintegrated. The firebombing campaign had killed over 300,000 people, more than double the combined deaths from both atomic bombs, and left millions homeless. The atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 became the famous symbols of B-29 capability, but they represented the culmination of a campaign, not the entirety of it. The firebombing had already broken Japan's capacity to continue fighting. The atomic bombs demonstrated that America possessed weapons so powerful that even fortified underground facilities offered no protection. But the message had been delivered months earlier by conventional incendiaries. Continued resistance meant complete annihilation of Japanese urban civilization. Post-war interrogations of Japanese military leadership revealed the bombing campaign's psychological impact. Admiral Somu Toyota stated, "The B-29 raids demonstrated American technological superiority so completely that continued conventional warfare became obviously futile. We could train more pilots, but we couldn't make our aircraft reach higher altitudes. We could position more flak guns, but we couldn't make them effective against targets flying at 30,000 feet. We could order kamikaze attacks, but suicide couldn't overcome a 10,000-foot altitude difference." The technical specifications that made the B-29 unstoppable weren't merely impressive. They represented quantum leaps in multiple engineering disciplines simultaneously. The wingspan measured 141 feet, creating an enormous lifting surface that allowed the aircraft to carry payloads exceeding its own empty weight. The fuselage stretched 99 feet, dominated by bomb bays capable of holding 20,000 pounds of ordnance. For comparison, the B-17's maximum bomb load was 8,000 pounds under ideal conditions. The B-29 could carry more than double that load while flying faster, higher, and farther. The range figures seemed impossible by 1940 standards. With a 5,000-pound bomb load, the B-29 could fly 3,250 miles, enough to reach Tokyo from the Marianas, bomb the target, and return with fuel reserves. Extend that to maximum range with minimal bomb load, and the B-29 could theoretically operate across 5,600 miles. This meant that once American forces captured the Marianas, every square mile of Japanese territory fell within bombing range. There was nowhere to hide industry, no remote location safe from attack. The defensive armament evolved throughout the war, but the final configuration mounted 10.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns plus one 20mm cannon in the tail. Combined rate of fire exceeded 6,000 rounds per minute, a rate of fire that could destroy a fighter in 2 to 3 seconds of concentrated hits. But raw firepower meant nothing without the central fire control system that transformed those guns into a unified defensive network. Japanese pilots attacking B-29 formations faced overlapping fields of fire that made survival dependent on luck rather than skill. The radar systems represented another insurmountable advantage. APQ-13 radar allowed bombing through complete cloud cover, something Japanese forces couldn't counter or replicate. APQ-15B radar provided early warning of fighter approaches, giving gunners precious seconds to prepare defensive fire. Electronic countermeasures equipment jammed Japanese radar, degrading their ground-controlled interception capability. These systems transformed the B-29 from bomber to electronic warfare platform, fighting in spectrum Japanese forces barely understood existed. But perhaps the most significant advantage was something Japanese intelligence never fully grasped: maintainability. The B-29 was designed for rapid maintenance, with panels that opened easily, engines that could be changed in hours rather than days, and systems that allowed identification of problems without disassembling the entire aircraft. Ground crews at Marianas bases could turn B-29s around between missions faster than Japanese ground crews could repair battle damage to fighters. This maintenance advantage meant operational tempo that Japanese forces couldn't match. A B-29 might fly a mission Monday, undergo maintenance Tuesday, and fly again Wednesday. Japanese fighters damaged on Monday might not return to service for a week. American industrial capacity replaced lost B-29s within weeks. Japanese replacement aircraft production had collapsed under the bombing campaign. By mid-1945, the Americans were adding operational bombers faster than Japan could destroy them. The crew comfort aspects, seemingly trivial, proved strategically significant. B-29 crews arrived over target alert, warm, and properly oxygenated. Japanese interceptor pilots arrived hypoxic, freezing, and exhausted from the climb. This physiological advantage meant that even when Japanese pilots achieved firing positions, their accuracy and reaction times were degraded by the physical stress of operating at extreme altitude. American crews fought at peak efficiency while their opponents struggled with basic cognitive function. The economic calculations sealed Japan's fate. Each B-29 cost approximately $640,000 to produce in 1945 dollars. Expensive, but American factories delivered them by the hundreds. Each B-29 destroyed cost Japan resources to replace fighters, ammunition, and fuel they could no longer afford. The exchange rate favored America catastrophically. Japan could destroy B-29s, but each kill cost them more than the Americans lost, while the bombers continued burning Japanese cities regardless of losses. Japanese attempts to counter the B-29 threat evolved throughout 1944 to 1945, each solution revealing how desperately outmatched they were. The Ki-84 Frank fighter, considered Japan's best interceptor, could theoretically reach 34,000 feet, higher than the B-29 service ceiling, but theoretically and practically diverged catastrophically. A Ki-84 required 20 minutes of full-throttle climb to reach 32,000 feet, arriving with perhaps 10 minutes of combat fuel remaining and an engine on the verge of overheating failure. Japanese pilots learned to strip every possible pound from their aircraft before interception missions. They removed armor plating, reduced ammunition loads, sometimes even eliminated radios to save weight. These desperate measures gained perhaps 2,000 feet of operational ceiling and a few extra minutes of fuel. Improvements that still left them marginally capable against formations flying at 30,000 plus feet. The modifications also made them catastrophically vulnerable. A single burst from B-29 defensive guns would shred an unarmored fighter. The ramming attacks represented the ultimate expression of Japanese desperation. If conventional attacks couldn't stop the B-29s, perhaps suicide attacks would. Specially trained pilots would approach bombers, position themselves carefully, and deliberately collide, trading their lives for a bomber. The Shin-10 Special Attack Unit formed specifically for this purpose in late 1944. Pilots would fly stripped-down fighters loaded with minimal fuel, just enough to reach altitude, ram a bomber, and potentially survive by parachute. The mathematics of ramming were grim. A successful ram might destroy one B-29, but formations typically numbered 30 to 100 aircraft. Trading one fighter and pilot for one bomber at best created a 1:1 exchange rate that Japan couldn't sustain. America had thousands of B-29s and trained replacement crews. Japan had hundreds of fighters and pilots they couldn't replace. Even successful ramming attacks merely slowed the inevitable rather than preventing it. The J-7W-1 Shinden interceptor represented Japan's most ambitious technical response. A canard configuration pusher fighter designed specifically for high-altitude bomber interception. 6 30mm cannons, pressurized cockpit, theoretically capable of 45,000 feet. But the prototype didn't fly until August 1945, and only 2 were completed before the war ended. Japanese industry simply lacked the capacity, materials, and time to develop and produce advanced aircraft while under relentless bombardment. Flak proved almost as ineffective as fighters. Japanese anti-aircraft guns could theoretically reach 30,000 feet, but accuracy at that altitude was abysmal. Fuses timed for precise detonation often failed. Shells would explode thousands of feet above or below actual bomber altitudes. American crews reported that Japanese flak looked more intimidating than it actually was. Dense black puffs filling the sky but seldom close enough to inflict damage. The B-29's altitude gave them enormous safety margin. Even when flak reached the correct altitude, the fragmentation dispersed so widely that direct hits became statistical improbabilities. Japanese radar development lagged years behind American and British systems. Their ground-based radar could detect pinpoint formations but couldn't provide accurate altitude data or precise position. The vectoring information passed through interceptor pilots was often inaccurate by miles and thousands of feet. Fighters would scramble to intercept formations reported at one location only to find at the sky, while B-29s bound to its 50 miles away. Night fighting capabilities were virtually non-existent. Japan possessed limited numbers of radar for night fighters, but the radars were primitive compared to Allied systems and were easily jammed by B-29 range. Night fighter pilots hunted visually, trying to spot engine exhausts or moonlight reflections. The B-29's ability to bomb through clouds using radar made night operations particularly effective. Japanese fighters couldn't find targets they couldn't see, while American bombers could attack targets obscured by weather. The strategic situation by summer 1945 had become absurd from the Japanese perspective. They possessed fighters, pilots, ammunition, and fuel barely, but none of it mattered. The B-29s flew where Japanese forces couldn't effectively reach them, bombed with accuracy Japanese forces couldn't disrupt, and absorbed losses Japan couldn't inflict consistently enough to matter. Every night, civilians listened to air raid sirens knowing defenses were theatrical rather than functional. The B-29 crews faced their own terrors despite technological advantages. Engine failures remained a constant threat. The R-3350s never became truly reliable. Crews described flying 3,000 miles knowing that any of 4 engines might quit without warning, potentially over enemy territory or open ocean. The survival rate for ditching in the Pacific was grim. Many B-29s that survived combat missions died from mechanical failures, running out of fuel short of base, or crashes during emergency landings. The statistics tell a sobering story. Of 3,970 B-29s built, 414 were lost to enemy action, roughly 10%. But 1,191 were lost to operational causes. Mechanical failures, weather, accidents. The B-29 killed more of its own crews through mechanical unreliability than Japanese defenses killed. Pilots joked darkly that the airplane was trying to murder them even when the enemy wasn't. The joke wasn't funny. It was true. Yet those same crews kept flying. They understood that despite the risks, they were winning. Every mission that reached target inflicted damage Japan couldn't repair. Every bombing raid demonstrated American industrial might and Japanese helplessness. The B-29 crews weren't just dropping bombs, they were delivering a psychological message. Your defenses are irrelevant, your technology is obsolete, and continued resistance means complete destruction. The final months of the war saw B-29s operating with near impunity. Daytime raids at medium altitude became routine. Fighters barely attempted interception. Flak remained sporadic and ineffective. The bombers would arrive, destroy whatever target had been selected, and depart. Japan's military leadership watched helplessly as their nation's capacity to fight evaporated under systematic aerial assault they couldn't prevent or meaningfully disrupt. August 6 and 9, 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Two specially modified B-29s, Enola Gay and Bockscar, delivered atomic weapons that vaporized city centers and killed over 200,000 people. These missions achieved legendary status, but they represented culmination rather than totality of the B-29's strategic impact. The firebombing campaign had already killed more Japanese than both atomic bombs combined. The atomic attacks demonstrated that resistance was pointless, but the conventional bombing had already proven that continued fighting meant national annihilation. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that Japan would have surrendered by November 1945 even without atomic weapons or Soviet entry, purely from the effects of conventional B-29 bombing. Industrial capacity had collapsed. Food production and distribution had failed. Civilian morale had disintegrated. The government retained power only by making surrender seem preferable to continued bombardment that would literally exterminate the population. The B-29's psychological warfare achievement exceeded its material destruction. It demonstrated technological superiority so complete that Japanese military resistance became irrational. Their fighters couldn't reach the arm. Their flak couldn't hit them. Their radar couldn't track them effectively. Their night fighters couldn't find them. Every attempted counter proved inadequate, revealing that Japan was fighting with 1930s technology against 1940s systems it couldn't comprehend and duplicate. The Silver Dragon victory crystallized this dynamic. Japanese culture understood dragons as forces beyond human control. Natural disasters couldn't fool. The B-29 became that metaphor made real. It appeared, destroyed, and departed. Courage couldn't stop it. Sacrifice wouldn't deter it. Technology couldn't match it. The only response was acceptance that the dragon would burn Japan until Japan surrendered. The final irony emerged in occupation. American forces discovered Japan had been developing its own heavy bomber, the Nakajima G-10N-1 Fugaku. Specifications called for 6 engines, 10,000-mile range, pressurized cabin, and remote-controlled guns. It would have been Japan's answer to the B-29, except they never built a single prototype. Japanese industry couldn't manufacture the bomber that might have countered the bombing campaign destroying Japanese industry. The circular impossibility defined their strategic situation. The B-29 Superfortress, 141-foot wingspan, for temperamental engines, pressurized luxury for its crew, and unstoppable terror for its targets. It wasn't invincible, mechanical failures killed more than combat. But it was inevitable. Once America committed to building hundreds of them and bombing Japan into submission, the outcome became deterministic. Technology, industry, and will converged into silver machines that flew where Japanese forces couldn't reach and delivered destruction Japan couldn't prevent. That was the true horror. Not that the silver dragons were unbeatable, but that fighting them changed nothing about the final result. The operational statistics from the B-29 campaign reveal numbers that Japanese intelligence analysts struggled to believe even when confronted with documentary evidence. Between June 1944 and August 1945, B-29s flew 34,790 sorties against Japanese targets. They dropped 170,000 tons of bombs, roughly equivalent to the entire German bombing campaign against Britain during the Blitz, but concentrated into 14 months instead of spread across years. The tonnage included 104,000 tons of incendiaries that systematically burned 67 Japanese cities. The loss rate tells its own story. Of the 34,790 sorties, 414 B-29s were lost to enemy action, a 1.2% combat loss rate. For comparison, the 8th Air Force bombing Germany suffered loss rates between 4 to 7% during the most intensive periods. The B-29's combination of altitude, speed, and defensive systems created survivability that no previous bomber had achieved. Japanese forces were destroying roughly 1 B-29 for every 84 sorties flown, a ratio that made the bombing campaign mathematically sustainable indefinitely. But the operational losses paint a darker picture. Another 1,191 B-29s were lost to mechanical failures, weather, and accidents. The R-3350 engines, despite continuous improvements, remained temperamental. Crews called them the engine that could fail in more ways than they could imagine. Cylinder heads would crack from thermal stress, connecting rods would break, valves would fail, superchargers would seize. Some failures were catastrophic, engines exploding and showering rain with burning oil. Others were insidious, slow oil leaks that wouldn't kill the engine until you were 1,500 miles from base with no alternates. The crew casualties reflect this dual threat. Roughly 3,000 B-29 crewmen died during the war, about 500 from enemy action, approximately 2,500 from operational causes. The airplane was statistically more dangerous to its crews than Japanese defenses. Yet morale remained surprisingly high because crews understood the mission was working. Every raid inflicted damage that brought Japan closer to surrender. The mechanical risks were terrifying, but the strategic progress was visible. The economic calculation reveals why Japan never had realistic chances of stopping the B-29 campaign. Each Superfortress cost $640,000 to build in 1945. Expensive, but American factories produced them at a rate exceeding 350 aircraft per month by early 1945. Total production reached 3,970 aircraft. Japan's entire industrial economy by mid-1945 couldn't have produced 400 aircraft of any type per month, let alone sophisticated heavy bombers. America was building B-29s faster than Japan could destroy them while simultaneously building fighters, ships, tanks, and everything else. The crew training pipeline reinforced this asymmetry. American training programs graduated replacement B-29 crews continuously. Pilots received 250-plus hours of flight training before assignment to combat units. Navigator bombardiers trained on sophisticated equipment identical to what they'd use operationally. Gunners practiced with computer-controlled turrets in specialized trainers. By the time crews reached operational squadrons, they possessed skill sets that took Japanese pilots years to develop, and American crews developed these skills in months. The Marianas bases represented another insurmountable advantage. Tinian Island alone hosted 6 B-29 airfields handling hundreds of aircraft. The logistics infrastructure supporting these operations was staggering. Fuel farms storing millions of gallons of aviation gasoline, bomb dumps containing tens of thousands of tons of ordnance, maintenance facilities capable of completely rebuilding engines and airframes. Supply ships arrived continuously, unloading everything needed to sustain operations that Japan couldn't disrupt through conventional military means. The mining campaign illustrated B-29 versatility that Japanese forces never anticipated. Starting in March 1945, B-29s began dropping acoustic and magnetic mines in Japanese harbors and shipping lanes. By war's end, they'd laid over 12,000 mines that sank or damaged 670 ships and virtually paralyzed coastal shipping. Japan, an island nation dependent on maritime transport, found its internal logistics collapsing because aircraft they couldn't stop were laying mines their minesweepers couldn't clear fast enough. The B-29's legacy extends far beyond its role ending World War II. It established paradigms for strategic bombing that persisted through the Cold War and into modern conflicts. The concept that air power alone could compel enemy surrender, controversial and unproven in 1944, became accepted doctrine after Japan's defeat. Whether that doctrine was correct remains debated, But the B-29 proved it was at least possible when technological superiority reached sufficient magnitude. The psychological warfare implications shaped military thinking for decades. The B-29 demonstrated that showing enemies their defenses were obsolete could be as demoralizing as the actual destruction inflicted. Japanese civilians and military personnel lived under the certainty that American bombers could appear whenever they chose, bomb whatever they selected, and depart with minimal risk. That helplessness, the inability to meaningfully resist despite possessing fighters, guns, and willing defenders, broke morale more effectively than individual raids. The technological lessons influenced post-war aircraft development worldwide. Pressurized cabins became standard for high-altitude aircraft. Remote-controlled defensive systems evolved into modern electronic warfare suites. The radar bombing systems pioneered on B-29s became the foundation for all-weather attack capabilities. Even the Soviet Tu-4 was a reverse-engineered copy of B-29s that made emergency landings in Soviet territory, the ultimate acknowledgement of the design's superiority. The Cold War's opening years featured B-29s prominently. During the Berlin airlift, they demonstrated logistics capabilities by flying supplies into blockaded Berlin. During the Korean War, they returned to combat, initially bombing with the same impunity they'd enjoyed over Japan. Then MiG-15 jets appeared, and suddenly the B-29's technological advantages evaporated. Soviet fighters could reach the bombers' altitude, match their speed, and destroy them with heavy cannon fire. The era of the untouchable strategic bomber ended in Korean skies, killed by jet engines and swept wings. But in its moment, 1944 to 1945, the B-29 represented technological dominance so complete that it fundamentally altered warfare's calculus. Japanese fighter pilots climbing desperately towards silver formations they couldn't reach learned that courage and sacrifice couldn't overcome systematic technological inferiority. Their commanders ordering ramming attacks acknowledged that conventional tactics had failed so completely that suicide became the only remaining option. Their civilian population enduring nightly firestorms understood that continued resistance meant continued burning. The nickname Silver Dragon captured this dynamic perfectly. Dragons in mythology were forces of nature, unstoppable, indifferent to human resistance, capable of destruction limited only by their own choices. The B-29 embodied that archetype. It flew where Japanese forces couldn't intercept, operated in weather that grounded defenders, delivered tonnage that exceeded what cities could withstand, and returned to base to repeat the process. Not because individual aircraft were invincible, mechanical failures killed plenty, but because the system producing and operating them possessed resources Japan couldn't match. The final accounting reveals brutal mathematics. Over 300,000 Japanese civilians died in conventional bombing raids. Industrial production collapsed to 30% of 1944 levels by August 1945. 67 cities suffered major damage. 2.5 million buildings were destroyed. 9 million people were homeless. And Japan couldn't stop any of it through military means. They could shoot down individual bombers, occasionally achieve local victories, maintain defensive efforts throughout. None of it mattered strategically. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki receive historical attention as the events that ended the war, but the B-29 conventional campaign had already broken Japan's capacity to fight. The atomic weapons demonstrated that resistance was pointless because America possessed weapons capable of vaporizing entire cities with single bombs. But the incendiary raids had already proven that continued fighting meant systematic annihilation of Japanese urban civilization. The atomic bombs punctuated a sentence the B-29s had been writing for 14 months. Post-war interviews with Japanese military leadership reveal consistent themes. They understood by mid-1945 that they couldn't win militarily. The B-29 campaign demonstrated American industrial capacity that Japan couldn't counter, technological sophistication Japan couldn't match, and operational tempo Japan couldn't sustain losses against. Surrender wasn't chosen because of the atomic bomb specifically. It was chosen because continued resistance meant watching American bombers methodically destroy what remained of Japan while Japanese forces proved incapable of stopping them. The Silver Dragons. 4-engine technological marvels that cost more to develop than atomic weapons. Temperamental machines that killed their own crews almost as efficiently as they killed enemies. Strategic bombers that flew too high, too fast, and too well defended for their opponents to counter. They weren't invincible. They were inevitable. And that inevitability, the certainty that they would keep coming, keep burning, keep demonstrating that resistance achieved nothing except prolonged agony, broke Japan's will to continue a war they'd already lost.